She's loud, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
no, that's fine. And so I get to do all the great pastoral care things that I really love to do. And I don't have the responsibility of administration and budgets and meetings. And so that's fantastic. I absolutely love what I get to do. And I have this unique privilege of being with people at the end of life, which when I share that with people and I tell people what I do, so many times I get back, that would be so difficult, that would be so emotionally taxing. But I see it as really much more of a mission, much more of a vocation. The ability to be present with people nearing the end of life and at the time of death is really a holy experience, a holy time. And so I'm really privileged to get to do what I do. And so over the next few weeks, I thought that we'd talk about kind of the idea of death and dying in general. Some of the work that I do will make its way in, but 3 weeks on hospice care is not what anybody needs. But first and foremost, just to share this with everyone, and so we're all on the same page. We all have this terminal condition called living, and we're all going to die. This is a great equalizer. We are all on the same footing there, and it's something that comes for all of us. And while this is an important topic, we don't usually talk about it enough, because this actually has a tendency to make us a little anxious and nervous. So when we talk about death and dying, does anybody have kind of those anxieties? It kind of builds up in us a little bit. I do this for a living and I still get anxious thinking about and talking about death. It's scary. It's the unknown. We have faith, we have thoughts, we have ideas, but we don't actually know what happens once this life ends. None of us have been there. We don't get to go and come back and report. And so it's so it can be a little anxiety inducing. And so are there specific things around death and dying that make you anxious, just to kind of get those out there?
I would say some of my acquaintances and friends have talked about wanting to go gracefully, grow painlessly, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That being one of, as we get older, bigger concern.
Yeah, we're afraid if it's going to be painful. Is it going to be uncomfortable? Are we going to be in distress? Yeah, that's a very real fear. Anybody else? What are kind of the specific fears or anxieties around the thought of death and dying?
This is pretty personal, but I've got my mother's 92 years old.
Mhm.
Body's in perfect health, mind completely gone. And I have the biggest fear, having that genetic makeup that might happen to me too, when our body outlasts our mind, or vice versa. I just happen to have this particular situation. Kind of goes with what Sharon has to say about going gracefully.
Yeah.
And then there's also all of the technology that is involved with keeping people alive, and I don't know why we need to do that. Why can't people choose? No, I think I'm good. I think I'm ready to go. Oh no, we have to keep you alive. That bothers me a lot.
Yes, we're going to get to that in just a minute. Just that idea. Anyone else? Specific fears or anxieties around death and dying? Oh, no, that is great. And I wanted to open this up as well. This is the first time I've done this class. And so you are all guinea pigs. And so if this is terrible and unhelpful, blame Damon.
We generally do.
But are there questions that you have around death and dying. And I may not have the answers. It's very likely I won't. I'm not a medical professional, but I have great people that I can consult with and come back to you, and I may walk into the answer. Who knows? So, are there specific questions around death and dying that any of you have that over the next couple of weeks? That way I can be sure to hit those things.
I'm just curious as it relates to, your work and the work of hospice in particular.
Yeah.
How many or what's the percentage of, individuals who, choose to participate in kind of a hospice program prior to, their departure?
Okay. As far as hospice in general, hospice is growing. The idea of hospice care is becoming much more common. As as Dan mentioned, we've gotten to the point where we want to keep people alive. We want to stay alive as long as we can. And this is a different understanding than we've ever had historically of death. Death is historically, up until about the last 100 years, really. So thousands of years of human history, death has been understood as this thing that comes for all of us. There's no way to avoid it. There's no way to run from it. It's something that's going to get us all. And as a result, it wasn't something that was as feared. It wasn't as, we didn't have as much anxiety. And so hospice care comes and offers it offers an alternative to that. Let's keep people alive as long as possible. It takes the idea that, death is inevitable, and it focuses on quality of life at the end of life. And so hospice comes in, and one of the first things we do is provide a few different drugs. So that could be morphine, Ativan, things like that keep people comfortable, that keep people out of pain, and that specifically with people who have diseases that are causing an immense amount of pain. And so hospice is growing. Doctors, hospitals, nursing homes are beginning to recommend it more and more, because we're seeing that with care like hospice, allowing people to die with dignity at home, surrounded by the people that they love, is a much better way to go. And often, especially for people with cancer, this is a statistic that's specific to people with cancer. They've done studies and have realized that people with end-stage cancer that are dying from cancer actually live longer on hospice care when they're reaching the end of life, because those aggressive treatments have stopped, and it's letting the body rest and die naturally, and letting things shut down and do what the body needs to do, versus continuing to medicate to just keep us going just a little longer, often in immense amounts of pain. And so hospice is becoming increasingly common. And the people that we see, the people that I get to see, the largest diagnosis that I see is actually dementia. It used to be cancer up until several years ago, but dementia is becoming the most frequent diagnosis we see. And so a lot of my work is sitting with people who may have completely lost touch with reality, are no longer present. And a lot of times my job is just sitting with, being present, reading scripture, praying with, and just helping people have that calmness in the sense of anxiety. So that's the work that I get to do, and that's kind of hospice in general, because hospice takes the approach of we're not going to do anything to prolong death, but we're not going to do anything to postpone it either. Yeah.
I think I understand, or I have understood, that when you hear that somebody has gone on hospice, that means it's the end is near. And yet I think I have also understood that that isn't always the case, that in fact, you can be on hospice for extended periods of time sometimes. Is there, in terms of understanding when we hear that somebody's gone on hospice, is there any average for how long, days, weeks, months, people usually are on hospice before they pass?
That depends on when they come on services. One of the things that I hear most frequently is, I wish we had done this months prior. So what makes people eligible for hospice is if a physician looks at the case and says, based on average normal disease progression, this person will die within the next 6 months. That's kind of the criteria doctors go by when saying whether yes or no this person is eligible for hospice. And as you all know, doctors are not sure about these things. They give their best guess, but that's all it is. We have people on services that have been on services for years, and they continue to decline, and they continue to remain qualified. They continue to qualify for our services because the doctor continues to look at it and say, well, if this progresses normally, like it usually does, then within 6 months we'll be at the end of life. But I'm sure you guys have all known people that have been told, you've got X amount of time, and they last a lot longer, and people who have said, you've got this amount of time, and they went much sooner. And so it's not an exact science, but that's kind of it's not a death sentence. That's kind of that has been the view of it in the past, is that it's for the very, very end. But oftentimes the sooner people come on those services, the better, because all insurances cover it. It provides a lot of extra support at home for you or your loved ones. People are coming in regularly. It provides opportunities for respite, especially if your loved one is at home. Every couple of months, there is the hospice agency will cover 5 days of respite to allow your loved one to go to a facility for a week to be cared for, and allow you to go out of town, go see family, do those self-care type of things. And so it's really a remarkable program. Any other questions around death or hospice? Yeah.
Maybe a dumb question, but I presume this is prescribed, and you have to have a doctor's. How do you get on hospice? I mean, you get on the phone and say, hey, I think
sometimes,
I'm ready to go, or
oftentimes it comes at the recommendation of a nursing home staff or an assisted living facility staff. There's doctors and nurses that see people and will talk to the family and say, you know what, hospice, it might be time to look into hospice. And so then we get referrals from those places, from hospitals. Upon discharge, doctors or social worker may say, hospice is something that you should probably consider. And then at that point, there are, a handful of hospice providers around. Families will meet with different providers and then make the decision they feel most comfortable with. So and then if people are just at home, then sometimes it's just the family calling and saying, are we at a point where this is a right fit? And so then we'll have one of our nurses go out and they will assess, and they will do a face-to-face with a doctor or a nurse practitioner on video and share the information. And the doctor will say, kind of give the approval. That's the process. But we become more disconnected from death, especially those of us who live in the Western world. It's just not part of our life anymore. And so, like I said, the understanding used to be that death is unavoidable. It comes for all of us. the understanding also used to be that we all get to die at home surrounded by our loved ones. And I don't know anybody that, given the options, would choose, well, I'd rather die in a hospital or a nursing facility than at home. You know, I'd say close to 100% of people would say, you know what, I'd rather my last time be spent at home in the comfort of my home, surrounded by people that I love. But over the last 100 years, we've started to see people survive illness that has never been survivable. I looked this up this morning. Penicillin is less than 100 years old. Less than 100 years ago, we discovered penicillin. And since then, we've just been on this rocket ship of a trajectory, curing illnesses and people surviving much longer than they ever have. And so we developed a bit of a God complex, to be honest. And while we don't usually say this out loud, we have this in the back of our mind that, you know, all the advances that we have, medicine should really be able to keep me and my loved one going really indefinitely. It's kind of the understanding that we have that we don't verbally say. But that's why so many people are now dying in hospitals and nursing facilities. Globally, 53.4% of people die at home. That's just the global number. Now this jumps up way, way higher when we look at poor countries, low-income countries. 80% of people die at home. Any guess for Western developed high-income nations, the percentage of people that die at home? It's 27.3% die at home. And so in the US, I would imagine the US is probably a little higher than that, to be honest. But I mean, 25% of people is all. When all of us would say we'd rather spend our last days at home. And this is happening because we're now starting to see death as a failure. We see death as a failure of science, death as a failure of medicine, because we see people surviving things that shouldn't be, that haven't been survivable. So with this understanding of that we kind of have of death being a failure, how do you think this could impact a life of faith? When we don't see death as inevitable, it's coming for all of us. It's not to be overly feared or overly avoided. To this, it's a failure. How does that affect our faith?
You often hear the word fight involved in that. You fight to avoid death.
Yeah.
You fight for your life with all the assistance.
Yeah, there's all
like you
these-
have an entire coaching staff helping you or something.
Yeah.
There's all those martial verbs like I lost my battle with cancer.
Right.
The struggle and things like that. But you know, Christian theology has death, where is thy victory?
Yeah.
The grave, that has been overcome, of course, in Christ, but it's a sense that is something not natural to the world, that it is a curse, that would not have had to been were it not for human sin. So we've had a really difficult run of it in Western theology for thousands of years.
Yeah.
But almost accepting it as part of the natural cycle of things can rub up against Christian theology.
Yeah. Yeah, it can. When our hope and understanding is that, this isn't natural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My wife died a little over a year ago,
Really sorry.
and faith was something I had before that. And she passed suddenly. And one of the things that I see myself doing was going towards God instead of away from him. And that wouldn't have happened, I don't think, if I had the good faith before that. And having family members that cared and were very supportive. So I think I think it's hard for that to come when a person passed away. I think it's something that's got to be established way before.
Yeah.
That makes it easier or have a better chance of knowing what direction. And I don't know if anybody knows how you're going to act or react when that happens.
No, it's impossible to say. And I'm so glad that your faith was a source of comfort and support in that time, that you were surrounded by supportive people that love you and love your wife. That's an incredible gift that faith can bring in the midst of death and the painful season. I'm so thankful for that for you. But yes, that's very true, that faith can bring that comfort in that time. Other thoughts as we think about, our faith lived out, the way we exercise our faith, especially if it has to do with the other, how is that affected by kind of a disconnect, a distance from death? And when I was thinking about this, the kind of what came to mind is that we're, as Christians, as the Christian community is concerned, we are actually losing touch with one of the things that was so influential in the formation of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And that was the Christians' care for the suffering. That in those times of suffering and nearing the end of death, there wasn't as strong of an ethic in most of the Roman Empire as Christians brought to suffering and death. And so Christians saw the time of death as a time to minister to be close to bring comfort to those. And so as our ideas of death have changed, we're seeing Christians back away from that, from suffering. And it's not something that we do intentionally. It's not something that we've set out to do. But as our thoughts change and death is now seen as a failure, it's not something that we are as apt to go and provide that comfort as we used to be. And so, yeah, I think that we are losing touch with one of the things that have been most important to the formation of Christianity. And so, just to talk about death in general, I've got a few of these books. If anybody would want any, it's just called When the Time Comes. And it's a real short book on the dying process, on just kind of what happens as we're nearing the end of life. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time in this, but I do think it's worth walking through some of this. And I may ask you to share with me things that you have experienced in these different stages. So one of the first stages I want to talk about is withdrawal. That oftentimes, as we near the end of life, when we get within 1 to 3 months out, people begin to withdraw. People begin to go internally. They begin to go inside. During this time, people start sleeping a lot more. People aren't as responsive. They're not eating and drinking as much. They're just not as engaged. They're talking less. But what's happening is a lot of really important internal work is happening in preparing ourselves. What looks like sleep and disconnect is often our minds and hearts becoming okay with the end of life, coming to terms with, becoming at peace with it. And so often when we see that withdrawal, that's a piece of what's happening. Once we get within a couple of weeks of death, people begin to get a little more confused about time, place, where they are, who's around. They begin using symbolic language. Have any of you ever been with somebody that's nearing death that starts talking about maybe a train or a bus?
Yeah.
Kind of there's this talk of going elsewhere. This is symbolic. This is just kind of where they're at mentally. They're talking about this passing. They may talk to people who are not in the room. And this is something that's, and have any of you guys ever seen somebody talk to somebody that's not there? Yeah, we've seen that. And sometimes that's concerning, it's unsettling, it's a bit scary. But the mystics across all different faith backgrounds have held this belief for a really long time, that as we near the end of life, that veil between heaven and earth, that veil between life and death begins to get smaller, begins to get thinner. And so the mystics would say what's happening is that as we're nearing death and that veil is thinning, we're actually beginning to see and experience and engage with those on the other side of this life. So I don't know scientifically, we can't say whether that's scientifically accurate or not. But I think that we can say that, especially those with a faith, especially those that have a spiritual life, that engaging in that is, I would say, well within the realms of the bounds of what is possible in this happening. There's physical changes, pulse will speed way up, way down, blood pressure drops, skin color changes, breathing begins to get weak. Your body temperature may go get real hot, real cold, fluctuate between, cold chills and fever. Little eating, little drinking, all of this starts taking place in the last couple of weeks. When we get within days and hours, people are usually sleeping almost all the time. They may have waves of energy, maybe restless and thrashing about a bit. Pulse will weaken. Those things like swallowing that are just reflexes, we lose that ability. There's a big drop in blood pressure, more skin color changes, rattling sounds and breathing. Just all of those things happen near the end. And just to touch on that rattling thing, because this upsets people. This is distressing to hear, and it's called a death rattle. But just to put you at ease, to just give some context to the person that's experiencing it, it is not uncomfortable. They're not in pain. They're not in distress. What's happening is fluid is building up in the throat. It's rattling. There's medication that we can be given that can help with that, but it's much, much harder on those of us who hear it than on those who are experiencing it. And so just as you hear that with your loved ones, know that it's not a painful, distressing situation. It just sounds terrible. And then short breaths, longer pauses, and then death comes. And so I just kind of, as I went through that, what have you experienced? What have you seen as you've been close to death with those you've loved? Are there things that you have seen that say, okay, that makes sense, or things that you say I've never seen? Yeah.
Well, one thing you didn't mention that seems kind of common, and I know it happened with my dad, that like the day before he died, hey, I feel better. I'm getting a lot better. I think I'm on my way, and there's just this, it's almost like there's this last push. Your body is doing everything it possibly can. I don't know if it's adrenaline or what, but that more than the death rattle seems to be the thing that portends
Yeah.
you know, the coming of death. Is that your experience too, or am I
Yes,
just?
those waves of energy in those last few days, oftentimes, yeah, people will get this rush of energy. And I don't know the science behind it, I don't know the physicality behind it, but it happens. Yeah, within the last couple of days, a lot of times people, they're talking, they're more lucid than they had been in a long time. They're recognizing people, they're engaging. And yeah,
When we went to see his mom shortly before she died, they warned us, you know, she probably won't even wake up. She won't know you're there. Even if she wakes up, she won't know who you are. We walked in the room and she knew us by name and she wanted to sit up. So somebody helped her get the bed up. And we had a little chat. She was telling us about our niece who was playing violin now. And we just had a really nice chat. And she died the next day.
Yeah.
And some of the siblings did not believe that she had a conversation with us because they said, no, she was not communicative.
yes,
She couldn't
yeah.
communicate with anybody, but she did.
Yeah,
That was her
not-
favorite. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was that?
I was her favorite. So.
Yeah,
Has anybody else experienced that with a loved one? That, you know, rally in the last, that spurt of energy in the last few days. But yeah, it's something that happens pretty commonly. And when that happens, so oftentimes in my profession, what will happen is I will hear this happening from one of our nurses or aides that are with the person. They'll say, so-and-so is having a really good day. They're lucid, they're recognizing people. I called family and told them to get here right away. And so they'll call family and say, you may want to get here, spend this time. And then we make sure to let them know, or I will make it a point to call them and just talk to them and tell them, you know, take this time. Whatever you're doing, if you can stop what you're doing and get here, do it. You won't regret it. But I also try to be very upfront and say this is probably the last opportunity you're ever going to see them like this. And I'll let them know it's not going to last long, a few hours maybe. And oftentimes this is followed by death will come within the next couple of days. And so preparing people, saying, you know, hey, this is happening, take advantage of it, enjoy it, but realize that this doesn't mean things are making a turn. So, but yeah, you're right. Anything else surprising or questions that you have around kind of the
Something, okay, and my experience when my late husband died, and he had been unconscious, he had, and I think it's called an hypoxia episode, so that he'd been unconscious for a number of days, and we were all, you know, there in the hospital room with him and so forth. And they had said that, you know, legally they had to discontinue life support. You know, they can only keep somebody hooked up, you know, for a certain number of days if they don't have, you know, brain waves and that sort of thing. But I was sure I could tell when his spirit left his body. And when the nurse came in, you know, at the end and told me what the official time of death was, it was at exactly that time. So, I mean, that was a really, you know, wild experience for me.
Yes, and I'm sorry, what is your name?
My name is Ann Bulkey.
And I'm thank you for that. And
I mean, I didn't have any of those communications, you know, since he wasn't conscious, you know, there weren't any of those communications or, you know, where he became lucid and, you know, was talking to people or anything like that. But somehow I did have the sense of exactly when his spirit was leaving, that there was some kind of equivalent there.
Yes, I don't think you're wrong, because I've experienced just that sensation. Oftentimes, and I don't know the situation you were in, but oftentimes that recognition comes when a person dies, and there is maybe just one or two other people in the room that are just sitting and being present in silence, in that in just that being present to what's happening in the moment. You're right. There can be that. There's a shift. There's an understanding and noticing that the presence that I had felt, even though the person I love is not responding, they're not communicative, they're not caring, you know, they're not able to do anything for themselves, we still recognize the presence of that person. We still recognize the energy, the spirit, the, you know, whatever we're going to call it, of that person. And you're right, at the time of death, if we are attentive to it, we can recognize that that presence is no longer here. And even saying it, it's hard to say for me. And this is something I am present for on a somewhat regular basis. But there is something that is both sad and closing about it, but there's also, that is that moment that I talked about that is an extremely holy moment, in that recognition that the presence we felt is there, where we are in that moment in touch with something outside of ourselves, bigger than ourselves, that kind of transcends experience. It transcends color, it transcends race, it transcends gender, it transcends socioeconomic background, it transcends everything. This is a universal experience. And being present, being aware in that moment can be a very holy moment. And so I don't know exactly, Anne, what your experience was, but I hope that that moment was not a devastatingly sad moment, but a moment of peaceful recognition of what is.
And I think it was a peaceful recognition. And I think, and actually in this situation, my husband was in, it was a very small ICU room in the med center, and he was a very well-loved man. And so that room, as after they disconnected the life support, was packed with, you know, people who loved him other than me. And I actually think that feeling their love for him and for me also was part of what made that moment feel holy.
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned that as well, that so many of those things that we don't have language for, we don't have, we can't back up with scientific data and scientific facts, but that doesn't make them any less true. It doesn't make them any less real, because we experience them. And so those moments of feeling that love and presence and connection with others is incredibly powerful, especially in those sensitive, vulnerable moments. So we are getting within about 15 minutes, so I want to move on just a little bit. We talked about the process of dying. the physical process, I want to touch base just briefly on the spiritual aspects of death and dying. So the first place in the Bible that death is mentioned is Genesis 3. We go from these creation poems to death right away. And so I do think that historical context does give a little, give us some help in this. Most likely these beginning chapters of Genesis were written during the Babylonian exile. So these people have been telling these stories and passing these stories down through oral tradition for generations. And so now they're finding themselves not in a place that is their own. They're finding themselves in a place of exile with cultures and traditions and religions that are different than theirs. And so the Jewish people begin to say, okay, we've got to protect our faith heritage. And so they began writing down these stories that had been told and passed down from generation to generation. And there's something, while we go from the creation narratives to kind of the fall, what we call the fall, and death entering. What we see here is a very different interaction with death from the Jewish people than what would have been thought and believed in their surroundings. And so this is a big reason as to why they're writing this down now, is because they're in a place surrounded by people that don't share this faith. And so from kind of an ancient Near East idea of death and the gods and what was happening, the understanding were that the gods were kind of vindictive and not caring, and humanity was little more than a plaything for the gods. And so death was looked at death was not looked at in a sense of sacredness. Death is just the end of this game that the gods are playing, pretty much. And so, but what we see in the Hebrew scriptures is this interaction with death that is seeing something that's much more sacred. And so they're saying, okay, while over here, we are kind of at the mercy of the gods and we're just these playthings. Here's how Yahweh interacts with us. Here's how our God interacts with us. And while death has been introduced to creation, death is not the final word. Death is not final. There's not the same finality. There's not the same sting that death has, because they're saying God is meeting us in death and saying that's not the final word. In fact, death is going to be dealt with. And so it's a very different way of looking at death. And so the Hebrew people are writing this down to save what they've held dear for generations. And so in Genesis 3, this is the first time death is talked about. God says, if you eat of this tree, you'll surely die. They did. Death doesn't come right away. It comes eventually. But then from Genesis 1 and 2, these poems that reflect this perfection in creation, to, okay, humanity has grown and been kind of pushed out from this kind of perfect place. They've now gone out into the world where things aren't as perfect. And so in Genesis 3, we see that. In Genesis 4, we see the first murder. So in just a few short chapters, we've gone from perfection to murder. And in Genesis 5, there's this list of patriarchs and just their life. And it ends with, at the end of each person's commentary, and they died. And they died. Over and over and over again. This person did this, lived this number of years, and they died. So this idea of death in the Hebrew tradition went from perfection, no death, death has been introduced. Quickly, we've gone right to murder, to, everybody dies, and it's just the reality of it. And then, this is just a little side note. Just a couple chapters later, we've gotten ourselves into war. So from perfection to a few chapters later, war. It's just a big jump, and this is just the understanding that they have. And so that's just kind of that religious background, is that this is how the roots of our faith have dealt with death. And the Bible actually deals a lot more with grieving and mourning than it does death itself. Death is just understood to be something that comes for us all. We don't avoid it. But grieving and mourning is the work we do when we're the ones that are left behind. And so grief is this internal pain that one feels due to separation of someone they loved. Grief and mourning go hand in hand. Grief is this internal pain and suffering, and mourning is the external manifestation of that pain. And so grief and mourning go hand in hand, and we don't have a good relationship with grief and mourning. You know, we can look historically, even at scripture's accounts, and mourning was not something that we see done privately and quietly. Mourning is something that is owned. We own our grief, we own our sadness, we recognize it, and we don't avoid it. We say, this loss I had is real, and I'm going to show the love and care I had for this person through my external mourning. I'm going to cry, I'm going to weep, I'm going to curse at the sky, I'm going to do all of these things because we realize that that is a healthy, good way of dealing with our grief and sadness. It's processing it, and we don't do that like we used to. We don't have these periods of mourning. You know, we used to have 7 days of mourning that was when a loved one was passed. We gave ourselves that time to cry and to be with and to gather with people that we loved, and to cry and remember and share together. And for somebody that was really important, we give 30 days of mourning for. This just isn't something we see. In fact, funerals are something that are on the decline. We know that funerals are helpful in helping us grieve appropriately. It gives us a place to grieve. It gives us a place that is safe to mourn. However, people are being deprived of this benefit and they're opting out of funerals because of rising costs. Unfortunately, we've turned death into an industry. And so now those things like funerals are becoming out of the grasp of some of those vulnerable. And not only are funerals becoming more rare, but many are being cremated. Not that cremation is wrong, but often what happens when a family member is cremated is their remains are taken to the home of one family member. And that's where they stay. And so even a place like a grave is not available to the whole family to go and visit at any time, to leave flowers, to leave mementos, to continue to grieve and to continue to remember. So not that any of this is bad, it's just what's happening, and we're losing the opportunity for those things. So that's just to kind of give just some context and some bring that to the present of how we experience and we deal with death now. So that's about all I have. Are there questions, comments, things that are not clear, things that you would like me to touch on in the next couple of weeks?
Are there any statistics on funerals? How many people pass without having a funeral? How many funerals are church funerals and non-church funerals?
No, I don't know, but I will. That's a great question.
And connected with that, Andy, the anxiety that I've experienced with people thinking about cremation, and maybe there's something unnatural about that. And I know it has theological roots, you know, it has to do with resurrection, but do you get that a lot these days, or is it, you know, you
That-
can talk about that. some
Yeah,
other-
that is a conversation I actually have fairly frequently.
Yeah.
And this often happens with people who don't have the resources to bury their loved ones. And so they experience a sense of guilt for saying, you know, cremation is the only option, because it's all we can afford. And especially because the county will help with cremation. If people don't have the funds, the county will step in and say, we will do the cremation. And so a conversation I have fairly regularly is, you know, is this wrong? Like, are we doing something wrong in the cremating of our loved one? And I always tell them, you know, scripture says God created us from dust once. The impressive part is not God being able to do it again. The impressive part is God bringing death back to life. And so just recognizing that the physical state of our body, you know, God ordained, you know, this is most funerals you've been to, you'll hear the words, as you ordained in creation, saying, from dust you came and to dust you will return. Cremation speeds up the process of returning to dust. So
it's another question about
yeah,
cremation and not having a place of grieving, a gravesite or a columbarium to grieve over. Is that becoming more normal?
as far as
Because,
not
because
having that
I get that. I mean, I love walking the cemetery and looking at the gravestones and remembering people
yeah,
that I know of or knew or know of or didn't know, and wondering that I would, however you choose to treat the remains after death, I would call it a loss to not have a place to go to remember and recognize the life of the person who has passed.
yeah. And again, I don't know the percentages on that, but it is something that I'm seeing regularly. So here's a story that happened just a couple of months ago. There's a woman, her mother passed, and there was infighting in the family. Her and her brothers who live in Texas did not get along, and their mom lived in Nebraska with her for the last several months of her life. She was the caretaker, and it was a very poor family. And so they didn't have resources for funeral. They didn't have resources for burial or cremation. And so the county did the cremation, and her brothers in Texas paid for an urn. And their mom was placed in the urn. The remains of their mom was placed in the urn. And then because they bought the urn, the funeral home could not release the remains to the daughter. And her brothers from Texas came, took the remains back to Texas. And this has caused, you know, extreme pain for this woman who cared for her mom at the end of her life. And now those remains have been taken, and she doesn't have that opportunity to do that. And so while I don't have numbers and figures, I have been surprised by the number of situations where this is just the process. This is just what is happening. And so, yeah, people don't have that place in a graveyard to go just browse and remember and spend time and presence at. And so, and again, I don't know the impact, you know, the data around the impact, but I would anticipate that it's not a small impact, or it's bigger than we would imagine.
Oh, I would add one thing there. And again, I think this is a, good old money enters in, but it is, I mean, what, someone who has a, comfortable financial situation can do. I mean, the deceased person is cremated, but then the urn is interred like in the cemetery. And so there's still a place to visit. There's the funeral, there's the graveside service, all those things. So it is possible, again, if you got the money to pay for it, to have a cremation and still observe those other helpful parts of the ritual.
Yes, and you're exactly right. The problem with those things is money. It's a privilege.
It shouldn't be, but it is. So, yeah.
It's a privileged position. It's becoming an increasingly privileged position to have the resources to buy a burial plot, to afford interment, to be able to, place an urn in a columbarium. All of those things cost a significant amount. And
It's pretty standard through history, though. Not everybody in Egypt got a pyramid.
no,
It's
but
always been that situation.
yeah,
Yeah.
it always has been. The slaves and those at the margins of societies, unless there was a family burial plot somewhere that they could take their family to.
My parents both died 8 years ago. They both died in the same year. They had already had a plot. They already had a headstone.
Mhm.
So, it was just the funeral to be paid for.
Yeah.
And it was $10,000 for each of them. And we didn't go with a, plastic casket or anything. We went with just kind of a mid-range. That's a lot of money. If it's the family that's going to have to bury them, all those things together add up to an awful lot of money that, they just can't justify spending.
Yeah.
And then they probably feel guilty because, what did that show about their love for their parents or their loved ones?
Stuff.
There's a lot of guilt around it. So, but I will definitely look into percentages of cremations and how the remains are dealt with. Any other questions or comments? All right, well, I want to thank you guys for being here. Next week, I'm going to ask you guys to get a little more personal. I'm going to ask you guys to get a little vulnerable, and we are going to do more of a workshop type situation where we're going to be looking at preparing for our own death. And we'll be talking about, how do we prepare to die well? And so it's going to be looking at relationships is what we're going to be looking at is in that preparation. So I hope that you all will join us for that. And can I pray before we go? God, thank you for the opportunity to talk about a topic that is uncomfortable and one that we don't talk about enough and one that is distant from us often. God, I ask that this would be used as a place to make the topic of death and dying a bit less scary, a bit less nebulous and far away, and that we could begin to talk about something that is a natural part of life and more comfortable and more understanding in free ways. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and there are some books right here if you guys want to